Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to all the panelists and audiences. I am Pooja Kumari, a PhD student in Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Madras and Head of Women in Computer Science at IIT Madras. Today, we have gathered here for the panel discussion on the gender question in science, education, and research, organized jointly by ChintaBAR and WICS, that is Women in Computer Science. ChintaBAR is the collaborative in the social, economical, and political related topics. ChintaBAR aims at creating a democratic space within IIT Madras that can make us, the students, more responsible and sensitive to the larger issues of the nation and to the world. And Women in Computer Science at IIT Madras is a community for inclusion, visibility, and mentorship to bridge the gender gap. We believe that even today, women are facing obstacles in STEM careers. There have been huge strides in empowerment of the women, but we still have a lot of ground to cover on a regular basis. We are a community of motivated women who might someday call themselves to be leaders in their respective field and inspire more women to join STEM. Science, technology, and engineering plays a key role in the sustained growth and stability of the country. STEM education creates critical thinkers, increases science literacy, and enables the next generations of the innovators. With only less than 11% of the women holding senior positions at scientific academia, the issue of gender inequality continues to attract the debate globally. A research study in 2015 suggested that this disparity may be a result of prejudices systemic in our society from the very basis. The study indicated that almost 67% of the people participated in the survey had an opinion that women do not possess the required capabilities needed for the higher level scientific positions, whereas over half of the survey respondents felt that the evolution of women in scientific research is slow. So what were the cause of this apparent lack of gender inequality in STEM? Why does this equitable social representation in general matters to STEM, whereas we know STEM is an objective domain? So to answer these questions, today we have with us Dr. Prajwal Shastri and Dr. Vineeta Bal as our panel members. I wish both of you a very good evening and very warm welcome. Dr. Prajwal Shastri is an astrophysicist at the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, Bangalore, and specializes in the area of phenomenology of active galaxies driven by supermassive black holes found in the center of distant galaxies. Dr. Shastri was brought up in Bangalore, and after her schooling, she completed her BSc in Physical Sciences. She then went on to pursue MSc in Physics from IIT Bombay. She completed her PhD from Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. On the other side of our panel, we have Dr. Vineeta Bal, who is a scientist in the National Institute of Immunology, and she was a member of Prime Minister's Taskforce for Women in Science under the Ministry of Science and Technology. She completed her MBBS from Pune University and MD in Microbiology from Haskins Institute in Bombay, and later did postdoctoral training in Royal Postgraduate Medical School in London. I'll request both our panel members to share their thoughts on the gender question in science, education, and research in general. I request all the audiences that they'll have an opportunity to pose questions to the panel in a live QA session later on. Till then, they all are requested to kindly switch off their mic and maintain the decorum. Firstly, I'll request Dr. Prajwal Shastri ma'am to provide us with some valuable insights and her perspective regarding the same. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot to both ChintaBAR and the Women in Computer Science groups for this opportunity. And of course, needless to say, the topic needs more debate and more discussion. There's not enough of it. And I'm extremely happy to hear that the goal of both your organizations is to maintain an open level of discourse and debate, which unfortunately, in my experience, is going down in our academic institutions and not going up. So it is really, really important to have such examples and keep the debates going and open. So why this topic specifically, and what is the big picture? So firstly, it is of course only right in a modern civilization that every human enterprise be open to all people. And for a given enterprise, whether it is a practice of, say, law in the Supreme Court, or theater, or bus driving, or the people's science movement, or science in this case, one measure, not the only measure, but one measure of whether it is really open to all people is to see if representation of different social identity groups within the enterprise reflect the representation in the population. If they do not, then it is absolutely essential to ask why not. If there were equity along all dimensions, including caste, gender, sexual orientation, class, language background, would it benefit the enterprise? Well, not being so debilitates the enterprise, because it would be like putting an arbitrary qualification that, for example, we will only make the enterprise open to those with eyelashes shorter than 3 mm. So those with longer eyelashes or with eyelashes that you cannot measure the length of would be kept out. It would be debilitating for the enterprise, because by doing so, you're losing out on a whole swath of the population. Now, one thing special about the scientific enterprise is that it is one that claims to be objective, as you've already pointed out. And for that reason, the responsibility to ask why is even higher, of course, because asking why is at the core of the enterprise. However, one can't stop by just looking at the numbers, or even suggest interventions to simply increase the numbers. One has to see why there is a disparity of numbers and how that disparity actually behaves. So, along the dimension of gender, indeed, we have come a long way in asking how the disparity behaves. And now the evidence is incontrovertible that there are systemic barriers right within the profession of science that prevent it from being equally accessible to all people. And I would like to emphasize that, firstly, investigation of gender discrimination is not only about discrimination against women, but any discrimination on the basis of gender and sexual orientation, with a goal of building an enterprise that is welcoming to people of all genders, including transgenders and all sexual orientations. And secondly, I would like to emphasize gender needs to be strongly held as only one example of discrimination, not the worst example, but one example, so that we can learn lessons from it that inform elimination of discrimination along other dimensions. And certainly, it should not be at the cost of investigating and mitigating discrimination along other dimensions. So it has to be not a competition with the mitigation of discrimination along other dimensions. But just for completeness, let me quickly go over the typical, and I would say mythical, reasons given for gender disparity in science. So first, the idea that girls are not interested in science. In the Indian scenario, Indian Academy of Sciences summer fellowships for all sciences is won by over 60% girls. The DST Inspire fellowships for students are won by at least 50% girls, most often more than 50%. Neither of these facts suggest that girls are disinterested in science. So this is clearly barking up the wrong tree. Second, the idea that women are not competent at science has been shown not to hold water, among others by Kumar's study as early as in 2001 of no productivity deficit among women scientists as measured by scholarly publications. And Subramaniam has shown no pre-employment accomplishment deficit among women. The third popular hypothesis is that the discriminatory familial responsibilities on women are a barrier. Societal expectations are doubtless discriminatory, burdening the women much more than the men with caregiving responsibilities. The Global Survey of Physicists of 2014 did show for India that although many more male physicists than female reported as being in a long-term relationship or being a parent or guardian, many more women than men reported that careers change their personal life decisions. However, the gender gap is a function of discipline, with physics being worse than biology, for example. So therefore, discriminatory familial responsibility simply cannot be the whole story, and something within the disciplines is at work. We know that Laura Bassi, the first woman physics PhD and university academic from the 18th century, was world famous for her work, but was not admitted to an elite academic guild because she was disqualified on the basis of her gender. Marie Curie was almost denied the Nobel Prize on account of her gender and not admitted to the academy, despite the outstanding science research that she had led. Kamala Shoni was initially denied a place as a PhD student on account of her gender, despite having merit. These anecdotes are just a sliver of a historical legacy of gender bias within the science profession. And note, none of this was about attracting girls. In fact, there are science institutions, including the IITs, who disqualify women faculty hires if their spouse is already a faculty. And I personally know many women over the years who have been thus disqualified despite outstanding merit. I have personally heard decision makers say, we do not need another woman in XXX group, or that XXX cannot be given YY responsibility because she has to take care of 2 children. This sliver of anecdotes only substantiates what any number of statistical studies have shown. Kumar showed from 4 different Indian institutions as early as 2001 that with the same productivity, women were systematically lower in the institutional hierarchy. And take the example of physics. The fraction of women among PhDs in physics employed in higher education in India is about 20%, which is already skewed. But the fraction in elite institutions, leadership positions, and in honor lists plummets much further to single number fractions. The selective fraction being similar to the fraction in the pool is a necessary condition to conclude lack of discrimination, though not a sufficient one. On the other hand, the selected fraction being smaller than the fraction in the pool is a clear sign of discriminatory practices. So what do we do about these systemic barriers? It is not possible to bring down the barriers by just one step. We need multiple steps. And I want to illustrate with 2 examples. First is the Bulletin of the Indian Physics Association, called Physics News, which is a quarterly magazine of invited overview physics articles written for a general physics audience. Not very prestigious, but read by a few thousand. The fraction of women authors was, until 2017, hovering around 0 and very, very occasionally 10%. So what should have been the response? Typically, the response is to carry on as if nothing is wrong, which of course is a clear sign of bias in the profession. But a professional physics society has a responsibility and an obligation to not project physics as done only by men. And so it would be abdicating its responsibility if it did not have at least 50% women authors at the very minimum in every issue. So a slightly more quote unquote caring response might be to have a writing workshop for women. But that assumes that women physicists are not competent to write. In 2017, some of us came up with a different response. We guest edited a special issue of Physics News with an all-women authorship. And this showed several things. Firstly, competent women physicist authors were absolutely trivial to find. I did that job, so I know. Secondly, The outcome, the magazine, was as regular, meaning competent, of good quality, as any other. And thirdly, none of these women had ever been invited before to write. And in fact, I had compiled a much longer list in case of refusals, and none of them had even been asked either. So clearly, it was the editorial board which was biased and which was completely ignoring the umpteen number of physicists around them who happened to be women when inviting authors. I can repeat a nearly identical story for another scientific publication called Resonance by the Indian Academy of Sciences. So what is the lesson? If you're on an editorial board, especially of a publication that carries invited articles, you have an obligation and a responsibility to have a very minimum of 50% women authors. And it simply involves asking them and maintaining the gender gap. Nothing more. It's not hard. They're not hard to come by. The second example I want to talk about is mentoring. So much is said about mentoring and that girls need to be mentored. In fact, I've noticed that people are most ready to jump in and support and fund things for girls. It primarily gives everyone a warm, fuzzy feeling, but I don't think that is the need of the hour. I have already argued that there is no evidence that girls are not interested in science. So it's not only girls who need to be mentored, but all young people need to be mentored. All young people need to see that people of all genders, including transgenders and all sexual orientations and all castes and religions, etc., are role models. In fact, it is very worrying that currently we seem to be enculturing boys to believe that girls can't do science. There is this work that is published by Joshi and Malhotra in Current Science in 2018, which illustrates this, which was a survey of high school students. And it is the existing mentors who need very rigorous training. I would go so far as to say that the current cohort of academics must not be automatically assumed to be competent mentors, because many are not. They need to be trained to be mentors, because the typical situation is that, say, a young man with a good degree of preparedness will be mentored normally. But say a visually challenged person is asked to pick a non-laboratory discipline, and a Dalit person is told that she does not have the talent, so will have a tough time, and so on. And a woman who is seen as well prepared, also known as talented, will be given gratuitous advice on how she needs to learn to manage things well, and only then she will succeed, and how she should maybe not do observational astrophysics because it involves late nights, and not adopt the theoretical approach because it needs bright people, but adopt computational astrophysics because then it can be done whenever the baby is napping, for example. So while the onus to correct this climate is on institutions, in the absence of institutional initiatives, if students like you ask me what is it that they can do, for example, I would say they should take things into their own hands and seek to design a mentoring program for themselves, where they insist that only mentors who are willing to be trained in mentoring will be allowed to mentor. So to sum up this aspect, we need serious acknowledgement that we need to fix our science practice. We need it to be fixed so as to be welcoming of all people, and this involves a mindset shift from assuming that nothing is wrong. It involves identifying mechanisms in which bias plays out. It involves making governance more transparent and accountable and also sensitive. It involves a shift from conflating talent with preparedness, and it involves a rethink on the concept of what constitutes merit itself. So Geeta Chadha and Chainika Shah gave very good talks on these aspects meaning the aspect of the constitutional merit, in a first of its kind interdisciplinary national conference that we had last year towards gender equity in physics. And those are worth listening to. And I want to add one other thing. The gender can function as a litmus test or a canary in a coal mine for a scientific institution. If an enterprise is found to have gender disparity, that is a symptom that it is not a healthy, nurturing climate. And correcting it could potentially mitigate not just gender bias, but bias along other dimensions as well. So I'll stop there.
So, thank you, Dr. Shastri, for your wonderful words. I am 100% sure that it was very informative, and I'm sure it would have inspired many of us here. So now I'd like to request Dr. Vineeta to take this opportunity and give some treasured visions regarding the gender question in science, education, and research. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Pooja. I don't know whether it will be a treasured experience or not, but I'm very glad that ChintaBAR and Women in Computer Science from IIT Madras have actually invited me to be a part of this discussion. And Prajwal has already laid ground in many different and interesting ways. She has emphasized a little more on physics, but I'm probably going to do a general commentary, not necessarily area specific, though my background is biology, so I'm sure it will show every now and then. So first I was wondering whether to show any data to you about how women have marginalized presence in the scientific community. And data are telling, and as Prajwal also said, the marginalization is more pronounced in non-biology, non-medicine areas such as physics, which she illustrated on or highlighted, and of course mathematics. Thus, IIT Madras, which did not have biology discipline for very many years, was considered a place for training in engineering, sciences, and technologies, had a very poor presence of women. Other IITs were no different. Of course, things are changing slowly, not just because biology has been introduced as a discipline, but also perception of people has been changing a little bit at least to make things somewhat better. And I am saying this somewhat and little because that is important. It's not something that what Prajwal was saying, that 50% representation of women is completely absent. So we do need to keep trying. So let me start by quoting something, and I'm going to keep in mind what you as organizers told me what I should sort of focus on, but I'm sure I'll go off on tangent. Recently, actually, I read an article from somebody called Saujanya Tamalpakula. I hope I have pronounced it right. It was published in the News Minute. I don't know her personally, but its title was what attracted me to her article, and it said annihilation of caste and annihilation of patriarchy must go hand in hand. She writes, so that was the appealing part for me. I of course went through the article, and she writes how she can rely on feminists to support her ideologies and critical thinking on activism, on queer, gender, and sexuality issues, but how most of them have not internalized caste-based violence and discrimination of women. Of course, Saujanya is not talking about women scientists. This is in general about women, but this is also true, of course, in the science stream. A few decades ago, and my age I'm sure shows here when I start commenting like this, a few decades ago, we feminists used to criticize Marxists, communists, saying how they do not see that gender is all pervading. They do need to consider gender in every aspect that they are talking about. But they used to think that workers' issues address everyone's issues, and there is no need to consider women as a special category. With patience and dialogue, that situation has changed. Now, feminists are at a receiving end when Dalit feminists point finger to their framework of Brahminical family model as a major obstacle to progress and equality. We also need to learn, but we also need to think about other ways to integrate the caste issue with feminism. I thought I should mention this specifically today that the gender question is getting addressed in science education and research, but as I mentioned, caste and gender together are not seen very commonly, though there are definite efforts which are being made. Science stream, I think, is still falling into an exception category rather than thinking of the two issues together. Now let's think about whether it really matters if individuals from all walks of life are not present in policy decisions regarding science education and science research. I think it is necessary that everybody, every category of people or the large number of people from different walks of life should be present in the decision making. The outcome of skewed representation is skewed priorities. Priorities which are determined in the top-down manner by socially privileged few. And I'll give two examples, one on science education and the other on science research to highlight what I mean by this. You must have heard about the new education policy. This was passed by the present government, the existing government, a few months ago. Unfortunately, there was no serious discussion in the parliament, and it was not referred to the parliamentary standing committee. In the standing committee, representatives from many parties are present to discuss the issue threadbare. It did not happen. As a result, the policy talks about a thrust on online teaching, which we have become familiar with, but still it falls so much short on what everybody needs. There is also a policy which indicates that teaching will be significantly controlled by the government in Delhi because the online policy means online teaching means many of the pre-recorded sessions would be available for distribution. So that becomes sort of centralized decision making and not involvement of the local people. Without actually saying explicitly, the policy also suggests that if the number of students is less than 30, this is in the schools, and they are really single teacher run, say primary schools, they may be merged. Can you imagine who will be affected by these recommendations? I don't have to elaborate, but kids from poor parents, young girls, those who cannot participate, cannot go for 5 kilometers to go into another school, those who do not have smartphones, those who are struggling hard to attend a school, and many actually who may stay in the school because of the midday meal program, which feeds them well, reasonably okay, at least once in a day, are the ones likely to drop out. So this goes completely against the right to education policy, which is currently in place and is trying to be inclusive. I do see certain motives in this new policy, but let's not go that far and elaborate those for the sake of time. Second example is about an old research work of mine, and while the data are outdated, the principle highlighted remains very much relevant. As a scientist and a feminist with being trained as a doctor, I continue to remain interested in women's health issues. These days, there is less publicity for the so-called family planning. About 20, 30 years ago, there used to be very frequent advertisements on how to restrict the family size to 4 or 5. That means how only 2 or 3 children is the optimum size for the family. Eventually, it came down to recommending 1. But recommending, not forcefully implementing it like in China, but still as a recommendation. We are a democratic society. Whether everybody believes in it or not is another matter. The push to use contraceptives to achieve this was, of course, in the family planning, was, of course, on the women. Women should use intrauterine devices such as copper T or hormonal injections, which will provide protection from pregnancy for 2-3 months to say 4-5 years, or take daily pills. And one popular name for contraceptive pills was Saheli, trying to indicate a familiarity. Those things. There is no push for condom or vasectomy. These were the only two means available for men. Actually, I mean, I just say this, vasectomy is really a minor surgery, and this is to stop the flow of sperms in the man. And it is so easy an operation as compared to tubectomy, which is done on women, but tubectomy is still popular and vasectomy is pretty much not publicized. It was common to hear how women should use the contraceptives because they get pregnant and men don't. How condom decreases the pleasure that the man gets out of a sexual act. Instead of contraceptive devices, which are not related to the act of lovemaking, so instead of condom, contraceptive devices which are not related to the act of lovemaking are preferable. I hope you are getting a sense of how men's thinking was determining the discourse on contraception. Not just that, but it was also argued that there are many more approaches and devices available for women to use. They have a choice between pills and injections and copper T and diaphragm and so on and so forth. And tubectomy, of course, gives the ultimate freedom from pregnancy. How nice that is. In contrast, men have only a condom to use, which deprives pleasure. And of course, vasectomy, this is a misconception, and I should say this, vasectomy is supposed to deprive men of libido, which is not correct. But that is the misconception. Thus, both the approaches deprive both the partners from getting pleasure out of sexual intercourse. Sorry, if there's a background, I can't help it, but it's the crackers in my vicinity. Anyway, so do these arguments sound logical? Does it not sound correct that women have more options? Yes. But do we look at why women have more choices? Funding for research on male contraceptives has been very low. So it is the funding which normally drives what people choose as their research options. There was a lot of funding, is still a lot of funding to develop female contraceptives. So this is a simple-minded logic. So who controls the funding and who decides the policy? Of course, men. So men can decide on the direction the research will take, and over the years, the outcome is, of course, many more contraceptives for women than for men. Is there any scientific hurdle in doing research on male contraceptives and developing more options? No. If there is enough funding, this line of research can be equally pursued. Will not just equitable social representation, but also equitable voice and power help? Of course it will. So that's something that you wanted me to say about, and I thought these examples tend to give you a sense of how the world is controlled. So this argument also will tell you that science is not neutral. STEM, as you have been referring to, is science, technology, engineering, and some people would include mathematics. People like me would include medicine because I come from the medical background. But none of this is actually neutral. Everything is governed by socio-political considerations, and which quite often determine funding. The word STEM actually takes me on a tangent on stem cells. If you remember, in the United States in the last 20, 30 years, whenever the president was from the Republican Party, and even today there is still one at the tail end of his tenure, Many regressive decisions were taken in the area of biomedical research. Abortion by many Republicans, many of whom are religious Christians and more often Catholics, is considered against the religion. And hence, when Republican Party presidents were in power, they were against women's right to abortion. Early aborted fetal cells can be used to study stem cells, which have a significant role to play in the development of the tissues. Research on stem cells came to a grinding halt because of religious considerations of socially and politically dominant class of people. So the neutrality in science research, in a sense, is a myth. Let's think of gender in the context of us as students, current or future academics, and as activists too. As academics, it is our duty to take science to the people. Simple basic needs such as clean and adequate water supply appear very difficult to solve as a problem. We are still struggling 70 years post-independence. For years on end, we kept talking about prevention of diseases which are transmitted due to poor hygiene, such as typhoid, cholera, and others. Providing clean drinking water is a scientific solution for it with great public health impact. And this has been achieved in the developed world, not in India, and many other developing countries also. You must have heard that when women started getting elected in panchayat some 30 years ago, due to implementation of 30% reservation for women, many women elected as village representatives prioritized water supply as an issue over many other issues, including building roads, because they are the ones who had to make trips to get water for the household. While I do not have actual data, I've read many stories of such women leaders. Can we call it real democratization of power in order to bring clean and adequate water supply to the people? Does presence of women in the position of power bring in different values, different priorities in improving health? Of course, the answer is yes, it can. Let me move to the people science movement related question, which was sort of posed at us. And I think Prajwal is better in answering many of the issues related to people science movement because she's more active than I have been. I'm sort of in the periphery of the parivar, if you can call it, and certainly not an insider. But how does gender representation help in building the democratized people science movement? Was a question that you people thought is worth addressing. And I can elaborate it just on one point for sure. Nutrition and environmental concerns are, of course, a major part of people science movement. It has been claimed, and this is more in the past few years, that Hindu practices of food are primarily vegetarian. Removal of egg from midday meal was one action which had bothered me no end. Some sections of upper caste Hindus are purely vegetarian, but enforcing that as the norm on the whole country is a problem. I was actually born in a vegetarian family, and until I grew up, I had no idea that Dalits are traditional beef eaters. I had not met a single Muslim individual until late in my school days. So how, I shouldn't say protected, how claustrophobic, looking back at it, was my school atmosphere, you can imagine. And of course, I was also unaware that beef is part of Muslim food tradition. So, however, if Dalits and especially Dalit women are an active part of people science movement, can they bring the agenda of meat eating, beef eating on the table for discussion? Otherwise, we see that state after state is banning cow slaughter, extending it from cows to the whole family, as in bulls as well, and hence doing injustice to the plurality in multiple ways. I think I'll stop here. If there are, as and when there are questions, maybe I'll address a few more issues that we can talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really informative and it was truly to the point, and we really enjoyed your conversation and all the examples that you gave. So now, I would like to ask Dr. Prajwal Shastri a few questions on which she can put her views forward. So, ma'am, I wanted to ask, you can elaborate on your work with the Hyderabad Charter on gender diversity in physics. What were the challenges and opportunities that you had there? And if you can give us some of your experience, it would be really helpful.
Okay, so this was the roots of it are in the Gender and Physics Working Group of the Indian Physics Association. So the Indian Physics Association is a national professional physics society. And I had proposed to them that there should be a Gender and Physics Working Group in 2016. I won't go into the details of that right now. But we, as part of our working group activities, organized a national interdisciplinary conference last year. It was called Pressing for Progress 2019. And it was a first of its kind in many respects. So it was the first national conference to discuss the gender equity issue in physics. It was an interdisciplinary conference, meaning not multiple disciplines of physics, but interdisciplinary, as in there were representatives from the social sciences and the arts and organizational behavior and so on present at the conference. It had 30% male representation, to other gender people in it, and so on. And the attempt was to have both physics topics discussed and also gender inequity topics discussed. And the Hyderabad Charter, so this conference was in Hyderabad, and the Hyderabad Charter emerged from all our work before the conference and also a lot of deliberations that happened within the conference. And it is a sort of charter for which we have, so it's on the webpage of the Indian Physics Association, and the charter for which we've been seeking endorsements of physicists who are practicing in India or who are in India, including leaders of institutions and so on. And our idea is that if somebody endorses the charter, it gives them a sort of a starting document to think about the systemic barriers to gender inequity within the physics profession, and start dialogue and discussion, and maybe institute some measures to actually mitigate inequity. So the charter has some very obvious, what we call fundamental principles, namely people of all genders have equal potential to excel in all aspects of physics practice. Utilizing the talents of all is essential for the physics enterprise to achieve its full potential. So there's nothing contentious there. And then there are some guiding principles, and I won't go into the details of that, but based on these guiding principles, we came up with a bunch of recommendations. So there are recommendations in it for institutions and departments, for teaching, for conferences, and for national agencies. So maybe I will mention a couple which are which tend to sort of, some of them are, some of the recommendations are very obvious, but some of the recommendations tend to invoke a lot of discussion. So maybe I will just mention those. So for example, we recommended that a sociology course on social processes and science practice should be part of the graduate physics curriculum. So this was quite a challenge, because in general, it was in fact, the challenge was in designing the conference itself, because physicists, especially physicists educated in India, tend not to have studied any social sciences after their high school. And this typically results in being quite unaware, not just of societal processes around us, but of the idea that physics itself is also a human endeavor. And therefore, these social processes, quote unquote, outside society, will be absolutely mirrored within the profession as well. And so if we're not aware of this, we will continue to go along the wrong paths in trying to address, for example, gender inequity. And it's not very easy to get this idea across to physicists. Most physicists are resistant to the idea. They think they know, we understand protons and electrons and the fundamental things about the universe. And so we understand everything, but social processes are not that easy to understand. So this was one challenge, and I think, however, because we got a lot of very positive response both at the conference and afterwards, and endorsements for the charter, I think we have made some headway there, especially among the younger academics, that yes, we do need to listen to what the social sciences have to say on this problem. And I mean, they've been studying this for decades, and much longer than what we have looked at. And we're also not competent. As physicists, we're not competent necessarily to, we may be competent to understand if somebody points out to us, but we are not necessarily the domain experts in this area. So that is one example. A second example is that we recommend that diversity officers should be appointed by institutions as observers on editorial boards, on nomination committees, on funding agency committees, on faculty hiring committees, and so forth. So this is a little bit in contrast to what is normally recommended. So normally people say, okay, to achieve gender equity, you just have some women on the committee, whichever committee it is, maybe a scientific organizing committee of a conference or whatever. So our point is that it is indeed important to have women represented on all these committees, whether it's a conference or an editorial board or whatever it is, and it is important to have gender diversity at all levels. But that doesn't guarantee, I mean, that is important in and of itself. That's necessary, absolutely necessary and important. But that kind of representation does not guarantee that the process is gender biased. And that is why because all of us, whether men or women, we are brought up to accept sexist thought and sexist action, and we are dogged by implicit bias and unconscious bias, regardless of our gender. So even as women, we may be perpetrators of gender bias. And then, of course, there is the whole business about being inclusive and how gender equity means not only being welcoming of women, but also welcoming of transgenders, of people with varied sexual orientations and so forth. And so just having women on a committee, it's necessary, but it is not a guarantee that there will be a gender unbiased treatment. So that's why we recommended that people invest in having a diversity officer as observers. And there is another reason to do this, especially in physics, because in physics, the gender fraction is very low. And so to insist that every committee must have women in order to ensure an unbiased process, first of all, that may not happen, as in having women may not ensure an unbiased process. But secondly, it also puts a huge burden on the few women that are there. And it becomes really an extra dimension of discrimination against them effectively, because it takes time away from their research and so forth. So this is another recommendation which is a bit different. A third one I would like to highlight is that we recommend that self-declaration of sexual misconduct indictments should be mandatory for all positions of administrative responsibility and leadership, and academic fellow applications, and editorial board memberships, and project funding committee memberships. So we are simply saying that for all genders, regardless of gender, if there has been an institutional indictment, then that should be included in a self-declaration. So these are just a couple of things that from the charter that I want to highlight. And this charter is not meant to be something that you agree with every word of. It is meant to be a starting document to initiate discussion and dialogue, and sort of at a bottom up also enable people to come up with measures to mitigate in their own local environments and in their own spheres of influence. And an example of, say you do endorse the charter, what does that mean? It would mean that, for example, when you're on an editorial board, you would ensure that the author gender fraction is equitable. If you're on a SOC of a conference, you would ensure that participants, speakers, chairs of sessions are all they have a proper gender fraction. I would say minimum 30%. That would be my benchmark. Faculty hiring, if you're a faculty hiring committee member, and so on and so forth. So, and we have so far over about 300 endorsements, the charter.
Thank you, ma'am. That really answered our question. And then I'll now request Dr. Vineeta to answer some of our few questions. Ma'am, you were a member of Prime Minister's Taskforce on Women in Science. Could you please elaborate on what were a few policy initiatives undertaken in the recent decade to enhance gender representation in science?
Okay, thanks. I think what Prajwal has said and the physics initiative that she was talking about actually came after the Prime Minister's Task Force did its function. So in some sense, it was good for me to read and hear about few things moving ahead rather than staying stuck where they were earlier. And what we did was, I think, more important. Until then, there was no serious effort for collection of data on women's numbers as faculty, as trainees, as this, that, and the other. So minor numbers here and there were considered okay because nobody wanted to know possibly. But one of the work that we undertook was visited 8 or 10 different localities in the country from different regions, including Northeast and, of course, West and North and South, to understand whether there were local problems which were creating hurdles for women scientists. This was focused completely on women scientists. It wasn't about students at all. So in that sense, this was very specific. So there was data collection, and then the policies were attempted as guidelines for the government. The problem with this task force was that it was advisory in nature. In the sense, the recommendations that the task force made was, they could simply evaporate and get lost. Nobody can take it, nobody may take them seriously. And at least I used to think that is practically what has happened. But what we tried to do was something that I was very pleased to hear from Prajwal, that we recommended that every committee should have a woman representative. And at that time also we realized that having just a woman representative is not adequate. You do need women who are keen or who have actually that attitude to think positively about women's participation and not sit there simply as one member who is not going to talk about anything. So while we recommended presence of women, Prajwal's committee has actually gone a couple of steps ahead. So that's very nice to see. There was also a recommendation about retraining opportunities, because what was discovered was many women after PhD, while their numbers were pretty high, after PhD and very often after postdocs, women simply did not get jobs, or even if they got jobs, they left the jobs for household chores, what was described as third burden in a sense, or the second burden, depending on how you call it. So they had lost few years and then suddenly became outdated. For them, retraining opportunities of some kind, working from home was a recommendation, but not in every case. I mean, now I can see, since you women are from computer science, you may be able to work from home. And those of us who did not think we could work from home, the pandemic has actually taught us how, when forced to it, you can actually find newer ways of working from home. And that a lesson I hope will be more practicable and implementable in the future. But work from home or part-time jobs, these were some of the recommendations. In terms of retraining, there were the patent issues were gaining importance, or patenting was gaining importance. So in that sense, training for sort of, like a lawyer for, or a patent attorney kind, that was also recommended. What we had recommended, and it never materialized, and I do feel sad because I do not practically see too many women journalists who are science journalists. Many women have done an excellent job again in the pandemic. That is more health, but there is also science in it. So women and men journalists have done an excellent job. But we were saying that women who have been trained, unfortunately, who had to quit their profession, they should be trained to communicate well. So science communication, including science journalism, was also one of the recommendations. And more importantly, there were opportunities to be created for women to come back to science if they wished. So special funding opportunities which were meant for women with a break in career was evolved, and Department of Science and Technology was already running a couple of such schemes called WOS A and B. But Department of Biotechnology, after this, started another program called BioCare. Again, it was biology, it was not for physics, but Department of Biotechnology is biology department in that sense. So there was a BioCare scheme also which was introduced so that women after a break can come back and they will be given 3-year fellowship so that they can start research again. Unfortunate part of this was, at that time we had recommended that these fellowships or these project funding can be renewed and women can continue on these projects for 10 years, 15 years so that they actually gain enough research experience and can compete for faculty positions. Some of those recommendations have simply withered away, but there were efforts made for those. And what I see today, in today's, I have few slides which can list a lot of recommendations which were made by the task force. And if anybody is interested, I will send them at some point. But there is no point in going into the details of every recommendation. As I said, what I illustrated just now are some of the recommendations. In addition to that, again, mentorship requirement was felt as a need. And a further step ahead is what Prajwal said, that we do need to train mentors, and mentorship should not only be directed at young girls or young women, but also men need to be sensitive and sensitized to the discrimination that they indulge in. And it's such a natural cultural phenomenon for us that unless both men and women decide to take it seriously, it's not going to change. In that sense, there are many men who are also listening to this discussion, and I'm very happy that they are still around. So this is something that was a part and parcel of our recommendations. And suddenly, I think in October this year, about a month and a half ago, there were news items which surprised me. And these news items talked about how Dr. Harshavardhan, who is also not just health minister, but also in charge of science and technology, how science and technology ministry is trying to bring in new gender policy, and how with that many recommendations will be made. There are a couple of fellowships which have been announced. They are called Power Fellowship and power research grants for women scientists. This was something that was declared and is available as information. But the news items had actually said that there is this assessment for various research institutions or colleges and so on. And that assessment will include the number of women, presence of women at very senior levels and so on as part and parcel of credits that would count for ranking in the institutions. And I did look for information which would give me more details, and that unfortunately I cannot find. But at least there are some fellowships, and everybody suddenly started talking about gender equality and women's presence in the science activities and science research. And I hope it doesn't again just wither away, but there will be a substance to it, and there will be more women who can be brought into the fold of science research, especially those who have to leave science for one reason or another. And when we made recommendations at that time, which were in a way simple, that every research institute, every university should have its own creche and of a good kind, because women with young children do need a secure place to take care of their growing children. And at that time, many men laughed at us. Many men who were in power laughed at us and said, "You women who are part of the Prime Minister's task force, come up with a recommendation saying you want creches." So these are basic needs which help women in continuing their career, but that was considered very immature and petty of us to make a recommendation of creches. But wherever there are good creche available, women are actually getting benefit, and not just women. Again, here, men are also getting a benefit, because it's not only women who give, who are responsible for birth of children. It's also men, but men tend to forget. So apparently, what Harshavardhan said is that there are 18.6% women in India's full-time research and development programs. And this number has remained stationary for, 30 years. I have been sort of engaging with this issue of women in science since mid-90s or so, and today we are in 2020, so at least 25 years, if not more, and the numbers have remained stationary around 18-20%. Earlier, these were the numbers in biology, but if this is a number which includes physics, chemistry, and mathematics, I would think it's progress. So one is looking for some progress which can be measured, and that is what I would say the recommendation. As I said, these recommendations were made in 2008, and we had recommended that an empowered committee, standing committee be made, in which the Minister of Science and Technology would be the chairperson, and it was actually done. Unfortunately, this committee, empowered committee, never met. This committee had power to actually direct to the various institutions and research places to provide data, to put it on their website, to follow certain parameters. But if the committees don't meet, there is no recommendations coming out of them, and there are no recommendations to implement. So essentially, it's like going back to square one. But I hope that doesn't remain the case with the recent October 2020 recommendations. One waits to see what the detailed recommendations are.
So, thank you, ma'am. That was really good. And your views on this Prime Minister Task Force and all the inner details that we get to know was also important. So next, I would like to ask Dr. Prajwal Shastri, ma'am, you have been a part of IIT, and IITs fared in terms of gender representation. How have IITs been in terms of gender representation? And what were the forms of discrimination a female student or either you or somebody, some of your friends had to face in IIT?
Oh, well, yes, I did my MSc in IIT, but that was centuries ago. I mean, it was, I don't know if, how much, but okay. And I have to say, I haven't actually, kept track of data and things like that. But if you ask about my personal experience, so I did my undergraduate at a women's college in a small town. And I had read about Marie Curie when I was 11 years old. I read her biography. I knew that, she had had trouble when she was a university student and so on. But all of that seemed like from a different era and a different place. And I didn't have that experience myself because I always had both men and women science teachers. And in fact, my biology department in college was full of women and only one man, but my physics and maths were sort of equal men and women. I had one Roman Catholic nun professor of physics and another Roman Catholic nun professor of mathematics, and they were outstanding teachers of physics and maths respectively, and so on and so forth. So sort of this gender inequity in the sciences wasn't foregrounded for me in college. And another important thing was that this hierarchy between theory and experiment was also completely absent in my college. I mean, we treated everything as the same thing. And so in that sense, coming to IIT was a shock because on the one hand, there was this huge hierarchy of how only the brilliant people did theoretical work and the not so brilliant did experimental work. And then there was this whole gender thing. So the gender experience was mixed. I would say our professors did a couple of good things. I don't want to elaborate on it, but well, maybe I should mention it that we were only there was room only for about 60 girls in the hostel, and so when I joined, there was a memo actually from the administration to all departments saying, don't recruit girls because we don't have room in the hostel. And our physics professors, and there was only one woman professor at the time in physics, they wrote back saying, no room is an administrative problem, so the administration should deal with it, and we are going to stick to merit. And so that was very commendable, from the side of the faculty. Our peer group, I would say, it was not a level playing field. I mean, there was a lot of this stuff about how girls did well because they were Maggu, girls did well because they were girls, they got good grades because they were girls. I mean, this is stuff that we had to hear all the time. Engineering classes had very few girls, and so if a girl asked a question, she would be laughed at. We didn't have that experience because in that particular MSc class, we were 50% girls, but friends of mine would, talk about all this. So there was all this going on. And what I haven't done any kind of survey of what the ambience is like there. But what I do know is that although women faculty are many more now in IITs compared to then the fraction of students has not gone up that much. And so there was this whole thing a few years ago where the Joint Admissions Board came up with a committee to look into the issue. And what astonished me, there were a couple of things about that whole report which astonished me. First of all, there was this study that one of the IITs had done, IIT Delhi in fact, where they were looking at underperformance, but they found that women perform better than men within IITs. And we know that women perform better than men in school boards. So then nobody seemed to get interested in this result and ask why then does the JEE select so badly in terms of gender fraction. And the other thing which astonished me was that the the JAB, the Joint Admissions Board, came up with this report on this whole thing as to what to do about the low women fraction in the JEE. But it didn't seem to result in any kind of discussion in the IIT. And most friends of mine who are faculty in IITs were not even aware that there was such a report. It was discussed all over the media. In fact, that's how I got to know about it, because some media asked me to do a piece on it, because I was, and that's when I sort of got into it and looked at some of the issues. But it was not, it didn't seem to be have been discussed within the IITs. And it seemed to have completely ignored this study, which showed that women do perform better than men within IITs. And so I don't know. I mean, I really wonder why this issue is not taken more seriously, and that there is not more debate on this. Because, as I said in my earlier presentation, I think the gender is also like a canary in a coal mine. If you see that there is a low fraction in gender, that indicates that something is wrong. And it is very likely that those wrong things are working against other dimensions of discrimination as well. So, yeah, I guess I can sort of post the article I wrote and scroll in the chat, perhaps.
Yes, ma'am. Sure, we would love to have those articles. And like, how can student group like us intervene in these issues? Like, since we are here at IIT, how can we do something for the students on this similar topic?
One thing is, I think you should gather data. I think there should be collaboration with the social. All the IITs have social science departments, and so the data on the JEE and all of that, gender fraction, other background data should be investigated to see where are the gaps and why is the JEE so skewed in the kind of people it selects. Because you see, the JEE on paper is supposed to select students who are passionate and competent in engineering and the science, right? I mean, you would think. But is it really doing that? And if not, what is it doing? Right? And people, of course, will dismiss it all saying, oh, coaching. And coaching classes are not equitable. They are in distant places where people don't send their girl students to, and all of this. But then, but that then is a problem, right? I mean, it means that the IITs are selecting people who are well trained by the coaching classes. Does that correspond to passion and competence in engineering and the sciences? Has somebody looked at this? And, so there are some questions to be asked. So I would say there should be, one thing you can do if you are within IITs is to look at some of these data. And the other thing that I think does need to be looked at is the whole issue of overperformance or underperformance or whatever it is, and how that relates to other social dimensions. So maybe gender is a sort of a reverse example. If it is really true that women perform better than men, it is like a reverse example of what is going on, and maybe that can say something about how IITs can make their education more inclusive to everyone along other dimensions as well.
Yes, ma'am. That gave a new perspective of thinking, like how just coaching classes are training students or like grooming students to be a part of IIT or giving that JEE exam. Thank you, ma'am. Now, like, I would like to ask Dr. Vineeta, ma'am, like, as a woman in science, have you faced any challenges or fallback that you would like to share with us, and like how do you think students and growing professionals should overcome with those challenges? I think, ma'am, your mic is muted.
Sorry. Yes, I'm unmuted. I would like to add just one liner to the JEE example that Prajwal took. I remember collecting data some years ago. I was trying to find out whether I can still get those numbers out, but it's too complicated. The laptop screen is too tiny to look for, search for many things. So I gave up the idea. But what I remember is that if you look at how many boys and how many girls appear for JEE and what is the proportion that gets into IITs, so women are marginally better. Okay, so if I'm not, don't remember, but it was probably 1.5 or 1.8% of the boys who get through, and something like 2.3 or 2.5% girls get through. But the number of girls who appear for JEE itself is so minuscule that even if more percentage is coming through, total numbers that you see in IITs is very, very tiny. And of course, some people did say this to me when I was reading that report, that the training, opportunity to do go to coaching classes from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. has its practical limitations. Women can't go out from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. and hence they will not go. And that might be undermining their confidence and parents' confidence to join the IITs or appear for the entrance exam is what I feel. I also feel the other patriarchal point there is that IIT fees are not tiny sums. They are huge sums. So if there is one boy and one girl in a family, and there is a choice to be made whom the parents will educate, the choice is very clear in most households that it is the boy who should be given opportunity to learn further. So many of these also must be contributing to why courses like IIT are not so popular, or why one does not see young girls entering IITs. But I must admit that ever since computer science was introduced as a discipline, in IITs as well as in ordinary engineering colleges, which had this civil engineering and mechanical engineering and those kinds of disciplines, the computer science started attracting girls like nobody's business. And you can still hear from boys who enter that, nobody will come to civil engineering or mechanical engineering. No girl would come to civil or mechanical. If they get only into computer science, then they will get into it. Otherwise, no. So this is also a bias that young girls also carry, that physically they are incapable of doing whatever work is required and they do not have inclination. So it is not just that boys are criticizing girls, but we also need to criticize ourselves and see if we are interested in approaching areas which are outside of comfort zone. I'm sorry, I just did some detour to the question that I was asked, but that's what happens. Anyway, so as a woman in science, it is interesting in the sense that when I entered science, it was really many years ago, about 40 years ago. So it is a long time ago. I also wonder whether my memory is still so sharp that I will actually recollect if there was serious discrimination or not. But you must have seen sexual harassment as a common event, which is talked about now a lot more than, say, the gender-based discrimination, for all you know. But in the case of sexual harassment, it is very difficult to provide proof and say, this is what happened, and that because of which I'm calling it sexual harassment. I have been sexually harassed, and this is the boy who has harassed me, or this is whoever who has harassed me. All of that is something that we find very hard to prove. gender-based discrimination falls into the same category. It's very subtle, and as Prajwal was also saying, that there will be minor comments made here and there, which you will wonder whether this was a taunt at me or did I mishear. So these kinds of discriminations did happen, but I think I was always vocal about it, and I could, I suppose, express myself reasonably clearly. So it might have created sort of an atmosphere that this young girl when I was a young girl and this woman when I became a little older, that she is too aggressive, too outspoken, so it's better not to cross the swords and take up a fight with her, because otherwise it might be hard to defend oneself. So that might have been a case. Not that I have been fighting with everybody, but even if I say things, people realize that I do make it clear that they better behave themselves. And hence, probably, it did come my way in a very overt way. I wouldn't say it did not come in subtle fashion. And I had quoted one example many, many years ago, and that was traumatic, but fortunately, it was also something that I could handle. My first work, I joined National Institute of Immunology in 1990, and our first manuscript, I had a colleague of mine who and I and our students were working together, and I was supposedly the last author. Supposedly is not correct. I was the last author on that paper, and because it was my research question, but he, as my colleague, had also contributed. So when that paper got published, people started asking him to talk about that work, give a seminar. So he had to tell that it is, I'm a middle author. The last author and the senior author is sitting next to me. You better ask her. Otherwise, it is inappropriate. I don't wish to take credit at all. So because he said this, it was easier. I mean, it wasn't easy for men around me to handle it, but it was easier for me to handle the situation because he was not willing to take the credit where it was not due. So these kinds of discriminatory things did happen. And I'll also quote an example of how people who are in high places do not appreciate frank discussions on women in science. And if somebody says that your institution, as in whoever is heading that institute as a man, your institution is also not really fair and is somewhat discriminatory, that doesn't go down very well. And I had this president of a national science academy coming and talking down at me because I'm not a member of any of the science academies. So I'm a complete outsider, but I was invited because I have some opinions about women in science, and I made some observations and comments. And in the tea break, he actually came up to me and said, just because you are in National Institute of Immunology, I'm tolerating you. But the way you speak is completely reprehensible. I said, what did I do? So he said, no, the way you criticize as if we don't do anything. I said, yes, you don't do enough. But he had, president of an academy, a man, had a cheek to come and talk to me like this, saying he is simply entertaining me and not throwing me out because I come from a prestigious institution. There has nothing to do with me and what I said. He was so hurt. And I was wondering whether I should publicize this. I did publicize it and did call him names, at least in private, thinking that such things should not be done to other women. But did I care in any seriousness? No, because I don't think my ego was hurt. I think the way I saw it was he treating a woman badly. It was not me who he was treating. He was treating a woman badly. And if one can distance oneself like that, I can imagine that the depression that one can go through because the attack is on me is lessened. It is an attack on women in general. When such attacks come our way, it is not necessarily an attack on a single woman. And I have always thought of this as a perspective to think positively and to keep doing what I have been doing, which is pushing for women's equality even in science, which of course is miles away from reaching anywhere in a comfortable zone. So, I mean, examples are not necessarily representative, but you do need to create your own space, and you also need to have colleagues who are aware of your opinions and are not undermining you. Because collaboration in science is an important thing. Physicist, maybe Prajwal was working as, one human being and one student or something like that, but us biologists tend to work in big teams. And in big teams, undermining women's importance or women's abilities is pretty common. So having a last authorship or senior authorship and these issues become important. So making your mind clear is an issue that we need to have said openly and accepted openly. And also, I think sometimes it is better if men are not going to listen to you to find women colleagues who can actually work together. And this year's Chemistry Nobel Prize is a grand example of how one woman scientist found another woman scientist's work very complementary, and then they bagged out eventually the Nobel Prize for CRISPR-Cas9. So two women getting it is something that is, I should say, miracle, right, Prajwal? It is not going to happen again, at least not in our lifetime. But all I'm saying is that is such a rare event, and two women actually, when you read their life stories, that is what they did. I'm not necessarily saying all men are bad, but you need to pick and choose. And there are many men around. So pick and choose those who are likely to respect and treat you as on an equal footing rather than those who will look down upon you. And that is the choice, and that is the clarity that one needs to have, so that bad events come your way less often than they do even otherwise.
Yeah, that was really good. So, like,
there is one thing I wanted to add to what you asked earlier about what you can do as students. And I was saying you should gather data and all that. So one thing I forgot to mention, I think it would be useful for you to do a survey of the process of so-called counseling. So right now, as I understand, you give the JEE. Let's say you qualify, and then you and your parents go off to the nearest IIT for this so-called counseling session. And I'm really curious because I feel that the same problem that I mentioned with mentoring would happen in the counseling room as well. Because I think IIT faculty are doing the counseling and they are not trained to be not gender biased. And I suspect that they would be bringing all their patriarchal notions into the whole counseling process. I have asked friends of mine who are IIT faculty, what is your brief? When you are chosen to do counseling, what is your brief? And what they have told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but I mean, it really shocked me. They say, to get more students into our department. Now, I mean, to me, that seems absurd because, I mean, IIT is, I think there's no dearth of students wanting to come to IIT or come to IIT department. So I would have thought the brief is that, let us say there is a young person who wants to do chemical engineering. The brief would be that a chemical engineering professor would come to that student and explain to her or her and her family as to what it means to be a chemical engineer, and what does it involve, what are the various problems you might tackle, what are the various professional lines you might choose later on, this sort of thing, so that the person really understands and is not in some pipe dream as to what chemical engineering means. But I don't know if that is actually happening. And I do know that students in counseling rooms, if they say that they want to choose stream X, they are often told, but your rank allows you to choose stream Y in some IIT Z, which has got a higher prestige. So why are you doing this? So there are all these things. So I think it would be an interesting thing to do, to actually do a survey of what happens in the counseling room in IIT.
Yeah, ma'am, that's an interesting survey. Like, we'll surely try to incorporate and do all those things, and we'll get back to you with that survey results. So, like, I have a common question for both of you. Like, how do you think this gender-based quota and diversity hiring influence in higher education? Like, there are very few, like, as per my like data, there are very few students who go for higher education in India. Like, mostly take after graduation, most of the students take their job and they want a settled, secure life, like making money and all. So, like, how this gender-based quota and this diversity in hiring influence the higher education as well as even in the industries. Like, do you think this gender-based quota is actually necessary, or the different things should be done to keep a check on that? Like, ma'am, any of you can start, like, whatever one. It's a common question for both.
Okay.
We can start with it.
So I personally think that quotas are really a cop-out. Whether it's gender-based or caste-based or anything, it is an acceptance of failure that we haven't been able to tackle the root cause of why there is underrepresentation. And because of that failure, we then have to resort to quotas. So in that sense, I do think it's a cop-out. Is there a need for gender-based quotas? I think not, because in higher education, if you look at the statistics now in PhDs in science who are employed in higher education are close to 50%. In physics, it is close to 20. It's 20. It's skewed. In all of sciences, it's close to 50%. So I don't, the fraction drops, as I mentioned in my presentation, when it comes to elite institutions and honors lists and all that. And clearly, there is therefore bias operating, and so one needs to look at why and what the causes are, rather than have this. And quotas don't really tackle the root cause, I don't think.
I actually, quotas don't tackle the issue. I agree with that. But at the same time, I do feel that, and there is another negative point about the quotas, in the sense, if you come get an entry through quotas, then you perpetually get branded with the quote. And that also has consequences. So, this is an issue that people who are using the reservation for entry via caste route also do it. Women panchayat leaders also face the same problem. So the point that quota would brand you as belonging to quota, and even if you are very competent or if anybody is really good, that is considered as a tinted image or tinted achievement and not real meaningful achievement, which is sad. But at the same time, I do feel that for certain categories of discrimination, quota are necessary, because not having any opportunity versus having an opportunity with some compromise is, if that is the option, I would go for opportunity with compromise, because having no opportunity is much worse. And in that sense, for gender issue, and it's not just about women, but women, transgenders in general, LGBTIQ kind of people who do face discrimination in different areas and while working in such institutions or academic places, there I know the quota are getting introduced, at least for women. The positive discrimination or general encouragement and very strict guidelines that if there is a man and a woman with equal qualification. It has to be a woman who gets a job or who gets something, whatever the prize is. That kind of recommendations do need to be followed very strictly. So for women, I'm not necessarily in academia insisting on having a quota, but I am pretty close to that. But I know that quota, once the quota is made, the blame game would start that women are getting from getting entry from the back door, and hence because they are no good, that is what is required. So it is a balancing act, and I don't think I have an answer saying quotas are good or quotas are bad. They are useful to have. They are not necessarily always beneficial at an individual level, but they are beneficial to the community to which that individual belongs, so that you are looking at a public perspective for that community, for that gender, for that whatever minority or underprivileged category is, and that manages to progress. It is not the individual progress that I'm necessarily looking at. So if it is quota, it is beneficial for the defined community.
So with this, we come to an end of our panel discussion. So we'll see if we have any questions here in the chat box. There is one question by Hasbina, and you have addressed.
It's a complex question. She asked, how do we make people, especially research community, aware of the social nature of scientific research? And for that, I think what Prajwal was saying, that at least for physicists and that group that was recommending, that having exposure to social sciences is necessary. We as scientists tend to live in ivory towers, and we think that is all it is. And so many scientists who are considering themselves as rational creatures are really devout religious people. And that also I find sort of, contradictory, that if you are rational, then do you think the God exists? Do you think that God is going to give you blessing because of which you are getting Bhatnagar prize? I mean, that kind of attitude is something that is so contradictory, but most scientists do not realize that they are having these silos, that their science is science and rational approach to life, not to life, science and rational approach to profession, and the rest of the life they will live comfortably. And because most of them are men, they live comfortably because women have been running around and they have been feeding them, and the profession can be carried out very successfully. So that is the attitude, and hence I do think that most scientists do need to have an exposure. Natural science scientist is what I'm talking about, not social science, because they are forced to take some stand and understand about the society. But the natural scientists do need proper exposure to social issues and engagement with social issues. And what we have currently, including these, I work in IISER Pune, and in IISER also has a department of humanities. IITs have departments of humanities, but these are sort of band-aids, that they are very superficial. They provide you with an opportunity, but nobody takes it seriously because you simply need passing marks for that. You don't need to score well. You do not need to study it. You do not need to study around it. And that is the problem. And I don't know what is the easy way out. But yes, the social nature of scientific research is the next question, because many people do not even relate it to that. And somehow, I do feel, this is prejudice and bias, the kind of work I did, because I came from a medical background and because I had done public health as one topic which I learned, my health-related concerns or my immunology-related concerns could get connected with, quote-unquote, humanity in the sense of human health. I would not say humanity, but that connection came very easy for me, and it wasn't easy for men. It isn't easy for very many people. I'm sorry, I'm going to add a footnote. You introduced me as if I'm working in National Institute of Immunology. I've retired 4 years ago, and now I only teach in IISER. So I'm stationed in Pune and not really linked with NII in Delhi. I forgot, I wanted to say this in the beginning. Just now when I started talking, it came back to me. Sorry about it.
So, like, are there any linkage between this pseudoscience and social, what we say, under the representation of scientific domains? So, like, if you could give some words for that. Just a short description for that.
Short description. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll say our culture and the silos that I was talking about, scientists who are very religious and who are not socially aware or rational really, that is a problem that we do face. And I'll give one example for which I'm sure I'll get a flack, but never mind. That there was a few years ago, there was a clear call for funding from the present government in its first avatar, earlier avatar, about proving that cow's urine has many positive effects. Okay, a research question should have been, does cow's urine have any effects? If yes, what effects? If no, does that mean all the literature that we have been hearing or talking about is myth, including what is quoted in our mythology? That was not how it was framed. It was framed, the major funding, some crores of funding which went to IIT Delhi, was to prove that not cow's urine, Panchagavya. Panchagavya works. Okay, this is, I think, the pseudoscience coming into science. And then, unfortunately, if there is a lot of money, some of us will certainly chase the goal and prove it. I mean, it's not impossible to generate data if you have a very strong bias to prove a point. The neutrality of science is also looking at neutrality in your question, ability to answer the questions, framing questions, and not simply deciding a path that you want to follow and follow it regardless. That's where the pseudoscience comes in, as just one example.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, both our panelists, Prajwal Shastri, ma'am, and Vineeta Bal, ma'am. It was really a great experience having both of you here with us today. So with this, we have come to an end of our panel discussion. And thank you, everybody, whoever was here. Thank you.
Thank you.